case study. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time with you and Barbara as well, just talking through the expectations for your assignment on due on the 22nd of October, so 22nd of this month. Standard things that we talked about beforehand. This is a 2,000 word assignment, subject, of course, to the normal 10% rule. We're looking at a report format, so just know we're not looking for formal introductions or formal conclusions per se. It is just effectively driving up or drawing up the answers. And of course, as always, we expect you to draw on resource. So it might be anything from your textbook, or it might be academically published research where appropriate. And there's lots of stuff around the expectation gap here that you might be using. And again, we expect appropriate academic referencing in line with your expectations around the Harvard-style approach to referencing that the university uses. So that's just your very standard kind of material, so well written, in a report format, not necessarily requiring that sort of essay space more generally. Now, as you know, we've been doing quite a lot of work as a kind of thematic and a conversation throughout the unit on this idea of the audit expectation gap. Now, in our very first tutorial, in both week one in lecture and also in our first tutorial, we did present this model to you, which is the model of the expectation gap as discussed by Brenda Porter in 1993. And there is this big concept, this global concept of the expectation gap. But as you looked at in your tutorial, and you might want to go back and look at your notes or revisit the question that we asked in that space, and potentially even go read work like Brenda Porter's article and all the other articles that we just gave to you in relation to that tutorial, which talked a lot about what is the expectation gap. What the model shows is the expectation gap is split between two components. So one, a performance gap more generally, and the performance gap is understood as being around challenges around performance versus the role of auditing standards, and the reasonableness gap, which is to do with the nature of the expectation. And that often is suggested to emerge in terms of how the public or society understands the role of auditing more generally. So to some degree, your assignment is going to ask you to interrogate the macro concept of the audit expectation gap. But I would be expecting, and Barbara and I are expecting, that you would be looking at some components of this. So some components potentially from the performance gap. So is it a problem around performance, or is it a problem around standards? Or from the reasonableness gap in terms of the nature of the expectations that that individuals have. So that's kind of part one of the assignment, is that the macro goal is to provide evidence to interrogate the concept of the expectation gap more generally. What we're asking you to do, though, is also reflect on the audit process that we've been talking through. So this is ASIC's graph or diagram of the audit process, very similar to what Barbara and I have been presenting in the case study work we've been doing over the last couple of weeks. But basically the planning phase, so that's very much in that kind of idea of looking at control systems, understanding the organizations, identifying risk, etc. The performance phase, which comes down to questions of sampling and looking for substantive evidence and materiality, and then moving into the reporting phase, the final conclusions with respect to what the conclusions, the opinion generated in relation to sufficiency of evidence, appropriateness of evidence, and the overarching nature of assurance or level of assurance that you can give in relation to the particular audit itself. So what we're asking you to do is relate this diagram to this diagram. But the way we're going to do that comes down to the individual requirements more generally. So you are expected to identify in relation to each phase, so one element of planning, one element of performance, and one element of reporting. So, for example, you might look at looking at control mechanisms or the identification of risk within the planning stage, or understanding the business. You might look at in performance, sampling, or you might look at materiality, or you might look at substantive procedures or something similar. And in the reporting phase, you might look at the overall conclusion, the nature of the audit report, all that kind of stuff. And you identify one of those elements and relate it to the expectation gap. So in other words, your argument would be, when I look at the process of sampling, so when Barbara did our lecture on sampling and looked at the way that auditors choose how much of a set of accounts they will look at in relation to identified risks and errors, etc., and the nature that they go about identifying how much is necessary to be able to draw their conclusions, how does that lend itself to the audit expectation gap more generally, but specifically what part of the expectation gap do you think this might work or operate or enhance or support or something similar? So I could make an argument that this is sampling relates to a deficient standards problem, for example, because there are audit standards on sampling and they set up the basic methodology that Barbara demonstrated in our lecture. But broadly speaking, sampling is also at one level a flawed process, because while I say all accounts give a true and fair view, or these accounts give a true and fair view, my conclusion is based upon my sample. And that could be, for example, a deficient standard problem. Or it might be a deficient performance problem, because maybe I have understood the errors wrong, I might have understood the risks wrong within the organization, and that has interfered with how I've chosen my sample. And we talked about those kind of risks, either doing too much or doing not enough, those kind of problems that emerge in relation to sampling. It also could be a reasonableness gap problem, right? Because the public expects, or society expects, that when an auditor says, I looked at the accounts, the public might expect that you look at all the accounts. But that reasonableness gap might be a problem because of something like time. It takes too much time to look at all the accounts. We want timely information, but you need time to do all of that. All those kind of logics and those kind of type 1, type 2 errors that were discussed in relation to sampling as well. So the idea is that you must choose one process within each of the phases. So one process with respect to planning, one with respect to performance, one with respect to reporting, and your job is to make an argument as to how this relates to one element of the expectation gap. I don't mind if you use, you're not expected to talk about every single element of the expectation gap, so you don't have to go, sampling is about standards, the audit opinion is about reasonableness, and the identification of risk is about performance. I'm not asking you to do all elements of the expectation gap, but what we are asking you to do is to go, what is this relationship from planning, my particular choice I make in the planning space, what's that relationship, or what do I think is the relationship to the expectation gap and why? It could be, so that could be reasonableness. I then choose, say, materiality in the performance space, and I also choose a reasonableness problem, and I look at the reporting, say the audit opinion, and I decide that's something to do with the performance gap more generally. I don't mind how you make those connections, we don't mind that, but the idea is that you need to make those connections. And of course, to do that, you might draw on examples. So either a textbook example of a calculation, a media story about some problems that have emerged, e.g., as we talked about in workshop this week, Patisserie Valerie in the United Kingdom, a big revenue gap problem, which ultimately led to the organization's collapse. That's a clear problem around performance, for example, in both performance gaps and the performance component of substantive testing. So look for examples potentially, and of course, as good senior accounting students, drawing on research articles where appropriate to support your work. And those research articles are ones we've already disclosed to you, but there's a ton of research articles published on the audit expectation gap within the extant literature more generally. I think it's worth also just keeping in mind the final point on this page, which is it's worth thinking about the broader users or the broader stakeholders within the system. So the expectation gap isn't just about expectation gaps to investors, it is a broader concept. And so thinking potentially about how this might be understood by different users of accounting information may also help you to understand that. I think it's worth just quickly turning our mind to the marking guide. So you must show the link, so that's important. So show the link between your process or your part. So let's say the link between materiality and performance, the performance gap, or sampling and standards, or it might be the audit opinion and a performance gap. You make those connections. That's important. So we do need to see you do that. Each element that you choose needs to demonstrate that link. What's the problem? So why is this a problem? I think that's a really important part of this study. So tell us why each of these are problems in relation to the audit system. Then you need to draw on any examples. So this is what we think it either can be a hypothetical example or it can be a real example, and that comes down to the nature of your research, but we want an example to demonstrate the problem. A good use of sources, so really this is talking about that you are using other material to support your work, research articles, other types of material that might be there, and of course it's well communicated. And in combination, that is the marking guide expected in this particular assignment. So your job broadly, choose something in each of these phases related to this gap, explain why this leads to that, why the part that you chose leads to a component of the expectation gap in the more general sense. So I think that's how I understand the assignment. Barbara, is anything you'd like to emphasize in that explanation?
Yeah, I think that's also important to not focus only describing the concepts without putting that in practice. Basically, if you want to just say what is performance expectation gap is, great, but if you don't link to the steps of audit, planning, performance, and reporting, that will not going to be useful. So it's always good to link the concepts, not just leave the concepts and, this is expectation gap, great, this is planning, great, but if you don't show the link, will be a difficult part for us to get a good assignment.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I mean, it's not a general assignment on what is the audit expectation gap. We've done a lot of that work already. We know what the expectation gap is. You've done it in quiz, you've done it in workshop, you've done it in lecture, you've done it in tutorial. We know what the expectation gap is. It's now you to demonstrate how you see that gap emerging from individual elements that we've studied within the audit process more generally. So it's that articulation, and that's where you demonstrate your knowledge. Look, I understand this the way we look at the concept of risk. This way we look at risk leads to an element of the expectation gap because the way that we understand materiality, the way we perform substantive tests, or the way that we develop an audit opinion or something similar, all of those elements potentially combine or lead to the audit expectation gap. And if we go back to our very first lecture in this class that we recorded together, the thing we said is that it's your job to think about as we go through this, because we'll go into the micro processes of auditing, how it relates back to this macro problem, which is this gap between what people believe auditing is versus what auditors actually do, and what is the impact of that more generally. So you're now demonstrating your knowledge of that in the work that you're doing, and that's what we're asking you to do at this stage. In that sense, I think we've covered off most of what we need to talk about in terms of preparation for the assignment. More than happy if you want to reach out to us with a plan. So reach out to Barbara or I with an email saying, hey, look, I want to write about these elements together. What do you think? Happy to look at those. We're not looking at full drafts. It's not an expectation that we have the ability to do here, but happy to look at the plans you're trying to write or the examples you're drawing upon to see what you're doing. We're also open for one-to-one consultations and meetings. If you want to arrange that as well, send through an email and say, find us a time. But broadly speaking, feel free to reach out to us with any particular questions you've got. But your job is to identify an element, one of the steps within the phases we've talked about, one of the activities, link it to the expectation gap, to one of the components of that, and argue why it is with examples. That's broadly your job. 2,000 words, don't need introduction, don't need a conclusion. We just need, broadly, I would structure it on phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. I'd structure it as being something along the lines of planning, my particular, planning, risks, performance, materiality, reporting, the audit opinion or something. And that's how I would do it in terms of structure. Don't need a conclusion, don't need an introduction, but just need to report on each of those components and its interaction. Looking forward to seeing what materializes. Thanks for taking time to have a look. We'll talk again very soon.